Hello, this is Dan Farisi, Group Editor, Commercial and Security with Emerald, here once again partnering with the HD-Based T Alliance, Infocom 2024, talking to the most respected thought leaders in the industry about topical conversation pieces in the technology space. For example, how to make every moment teachable with the right equipment. We're really lucky to have a great duo panel here today. Erin Maher Moran of Johns Hopkins and HETMA, as well as Joshua Joseph of TechVox. Would you like to talk just a little bit about each of your backgrounds in education and technology, why you're here today?
I mean, for me, my mission is sort of twofold: to not only try to find the best solutions for problems that we're having at my university, but also to represent the HETMA community.
Yeah, so a little bit about my background is I've been working in the education space for about 10 years. 8 years on the reseller side and the past 2.5 years on the manufacturer side. So my mission is just to be a resource, take all the knowledge that I've learned from the reseller side, manufacturer side, and all the technology we learned to be a better resource for the higher education space and the education space overall.
Let me know if you disagree, but from an outsider's perspective, it seems to me like easy transitions between instructional modes, accessibility, equity, these are like prime focus points for education integrators and education professionals. What would be some strategies to create intuitive user interfaces and other means of getting those transitions right?
Yeah, I would say feedback is always a really good strategy when it comes to user interface. Because a lot of times that is kind of left out until things are already implemented and in a classroom. But I think getting faculty feedback, department leader feedbacks on what the instructors and the end users really actually need. And simplicity is always a big thing in higher education. It always will be to the end of time. And I think there's the bulk of the spaces that the 80% that needs just the simple designs when it comes to UI. And then there's that 20%, right, where there's specialty spaces, departments that need something a little different, a little more complex. But I still think that user feedback is the most critical thing when it comes to UI.
I absolutely agree with you. It's speaking to the people who use the systems and how they want to use the systems, and also the terms they use, because there are times where we've had systems installed that integrators have come in and they name buttons certain things, and our faculty are like, what is that? And we're like, oh, well, that's their way of saying wireless presentation. And so it's like those little things that goes back to the communication and the feedback of knowing what the end users are actually expecting, not what you think they should be expecting. And keep it simple.
Keep it simple, as you say. That's the advice that will be true from the beginning of time until the end of time. This is it's a loaded question because it sounds simple, but the answer is hard. What are the keys to, quote unquote, the best design when it comes to education? I know that's very, very broad, but if you're going to boil it down to one or two or three keys, other than simplicity, what would those keys be?
Yeah. High contrast. Oddly, that it seems obvious, but I think sometimes we start thinking about the aesthetics of an interface and don't really then think about the usability of it, and that not everybody is going to be able to see it the same way. So now we're making a system less accessible to the greater good that, but maybe not everybody's going to be able to see it because it was a little too close in tone. And we need to make sure that those buttons are popping.
Joshua?
Yeah, I agree with all those points. And I think from manufacturer perspective as well, like I think the best design is always focused around the functionality of the room. So best looking, greatest, it really depends on how that room needs to function, how that space needs to be used. If it's a standard classroom, if it's a collaboration space, if it's a lecture hall. I think that's what determines the best design, especially in higher ed, because it could be adjunct faculty coming in-room PC versus BYOM. all those things play a factor into what's considered the best design. So really, long story short, it's around functionality and what that room needs to do. Yeah.
So we've talked about the best. Now let's focus on the inverse. Not necessarily the worst, but the most common pain points. Whether they're things that cut against educational equity, like you were talking about, Aaron. What are the pain points that you see all over the place?
I would have to say a lot of it is clutter or unnecessary functionality that's right there in the forefront. Obviously, we're going to want to have that like hidden technician page that like those who are in the know have access to all the things, but really distill it down to those few things that the faculty or the users need and eliminate all of the clutter. Because I mean, I've seen some touch panels where they just want to put everything all there, and you're like, how's anybody going to find anything? Everything gets lost. So absolutely, that's one of the, I think, things that I would recommend the most.
What would you add, Joshua?
Actually, that was my answer too. But the clutter, even not just on the UI, but in the rack, right? Sometimes there's situations where there's 5 things doing what one thing could do, and that clutter sometimes really mess up and kind of the operation and the support level because you don't know what probably went wrong. So when it comes to high flex and things of that nature, looking for solutions that kind of encompass all in one, so it's kind of one point of failure and you kind of already know what could go wrong. And then I think the other thing is, from my end of things, is always that lovely budget in higher ed. And, how do you make something out of $50K and versus $500K visionaries? And I think that's the 2 things that I always run into. So
I'm gonna just jump on this real quick though. That goes to a lot of like managing those expectations, because we get the faculty or the end users that are like, this room should have all of these bells and whistles, and we're like, yeah, sure, that'd be great. Here's what it's going to cost, and then it's like, oh, never mind, we're going to dial it back a lot.
So let me ask a very similar question, but I think the answer might be slightly different. We talked about pain points in terms of the deployments themselves. From the integrator's perspective, from the channel partner's perspective, what are the biggest challenges they do face or they should expect to face if they're moving into these environments? And how might they be able to overcome those and deliver a good solution for a client like Johns Hopkins?
I feel like a lot of it boils down to communication and making sure that you're getting your information from the best source. A lot of times, integrators will come in on projects that came through like the facilities area, which may not be directly connected to classroom technology or AV. And so they have their ideas, but it may not necessarily align with what is really needed, because they have their ideas and the stakeholders might not be really lining up properly. So it's really about communicating and finding out who really has the right information from the people who are actually going to use that room.
Yep. Same thing. I think from our perspective on the manufacturer side, we work really close with our higher education end users because we want to ensure that what the integrator is supplying is actually what they should be getting. So from our end, because we do full systems, we have the full schematic, we have the full design. So there's no way possible that an integrator can kind of miss something, because the end users are going to have the same schematic, same design. So they're going to know what they should be getting. And how we make it easier is we pretty much provide an installation guide and an operation guide that almost you can't go wrong on, because if you just follow it step by step. But so those are things we kind of do different, especially in our high flex setups for the higher education space, so that we can make sure our end users are getting exactly what they expected and what we're told by the integrators.
So my last question is, I'm sure that every HETMA member, I'm sure you would say the same thing. Their institution has a strategic vision of some sort. So if there's going to be a technology deployment on site, you want to make sure you're evaluating technology, selecting technology in the context of that strategic vision. And let me know if you disagree, but assuming that is the case, what overall guidance would you give to integrators and other members of the community to make sure they're aligned with that strategic vision?
I think a lot of that does go back to that communication factor, because now we are, it's very much all about the flexible classroom, being able to easily use it for different types of modalities. And we're finding that even amongst ourselves, some of the terminologies that we're using doesn't quite mean the same thing. So what is flexible to one person was not necessarily flexible to another. So we need to make sure we're defining things the same way and then carrying that out while at the same time not over-engineering it, because I feel like that happens so often, and then we end up with all of these things that people thought was needed, and then the functionality doesn't get used, and then we're like, oh, that wasn't necessary. Great.
Anything you would add?
Just adding to that, I think a lot of times things get future-proofed a lot, and it's kind of just preparing for the worst. 10 cameras, this and that. But I think at the end of the day, it's a classroom. It's the same product. There's instruction, there's students, and so you can future-proof it, but there's a lot of times where you like you said, sometimes it could be overkill. But I think that goes back to the design piece, right? It's all about what the functionality needs to be in that room. There's certain things that, you got to move on with the times, like HD-based T, VGA to USB-C, things of that nature. But at the end of the day, and especially in education, it's just focused on the actual product, which is, good instruction. And as long as the technology works, most faculty users are happy. So, yeah.
Very well said. I think making every moment teachable, which is our topic here, does very much come down to finding the right equipment, making sure it's aligned with that strategic vision, has educational equity, simplicity in mind, all of these factors. Thank you, Joshua. Thank you, Aaron, for being here and sharing your insights. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.